his hand clamped over my mouth, cutting off my scream. "Nobody will believe you," my father whispered, his alcohol-sour breath hot against my ear as he pushed me toward the bedroom. "You've always been a liar, Margaret." I was 15, frozen with terror in my childhood home, realizing too late that coming back had been a mistake. As his fingers tightened on my arm, something deep within me, a survival instinct I didn't know I possessed, surged forward. I bit down on his palm hard. The metallic taste of blood filled my mouth as he yanked his hand away with a howl. In that momentary freedom, I ran. But that day in July 1972 was not the beginning of my story. The true horror had started years before, growing like a cancer in what appeared to be the perfect American family. Hello, my dears. This is Grandma Margaret speaking to you at 68 years old, coming to you directly from my simple home in Asheville, North Carolina, where the mountain chill keeps me company along with my memories. Those who see me now with my floral apron, my retired hairdresser's scissors, and my hair products scattered around the house would never imagine what I lived through as a girl. Before continuing this difficult story, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening. If this story touches your heart, please leave a like, subscribe to Grandparents' Tales, and tell me in the comments which part of America you're listening from. It helps me feel less alone with these heavy memories. The perfect family facade. I was born in 1957 in a small town in rural Georgia. One of those places with a central square, a main church, and streets that resembled dirt labyrinths turning to mud with each rainfall. Our house was near the lake, a simple brick home my father Anthony built with his own hands, taking pride in every nail hammered, every brick laid. There were 4 of us, my father Anthony, my mother, Josephine, myself, and my brother Thomas, 5 years younger than me. Family photographs captured us smiling at church picnics, 4th of July celebrations, and Christmas gatherings. In every single one, Thomas and I stand with practiced smiles, our clothes pressed, our hair perfectly combed. To outsiders, we were the ideal family. My father worked for the county my mother taught at the local elementary school, and we children were always clean and well-mannered at Sunday services. "Look at the Williams family," Mrs. Henderson whispered loudly to her friend after church one Sunday. "Anthony and Josephine have done such a wonderful job with those children. Why can't more families be like that?" I remember standing there, age 10, hearing those words and feeling my stomach twist into knots. If only they knew what happened when our front door closed. From my earliest memories, I felt my brother Thomas's eyes on me, not with brotherly affection, but with something darker. Something that made me uncomfortable even before I had words to describe it. Pure, distilled envy that seemed to grow with each passing year. "Why did Margaret get a higher grade than me, Mom?" Thomas would complain, slamming his own perfectly good report card onto the kitchen table. "She doesn't even study that hard. The teachers just like her better." "Now, Thomas," my mother would reply, her voice carrying that nervous edge it always had when tensions rose. "Your grades are excellent too, but they're not as good as perfect Margaret's." He would spit, eyes narrowing at me across the dinner table. At first, I thought it was just childish behavior that would pass with time. But as Thomas grew, that little seed of resentment grew too watered by the constant comparison he himself made between us. What made it worse was how my father Anthony encouraged this rivalry, this hatred. My father was a man of few words, the kind whose smile on the street transformed into something else entirely, once the door closed behind him. There were good days when he brought candy from town and told stories after dinner. But there were bad days, more frequent as the years passed, when alcohol spoke through him, and any child's noise became reason for shouting and violence. "Girls can't be smarter than boys. It's not natural," he would declare, crumpling my report card in his fist when I proudly showed him my straight A's. His eyes would narrow dangerously, whiskey, making his words slur slightly. You'll end up an old maid if you keep showing off all that knowledge. No man wants a wife who thinks she's smarter than him. But Dad, The sharp crack of his hand against the table would silence me instantly. Don't argue with me, girl. My mother, Josephine, lived divided between pride in me and fear of my father. I could see it in her eyes how she'd beam when I mastered a difficult piano piece or won the spelling bee, only to glance nervously toward my father, gauging his mood, calculating the risk of praising me too openly. Let Thomas win this time, honey, she would whisper before family board games, her fingers gripping my wrist with gentle urgency. But Mom, Your father isn't in a good mood today? She'd worn eyes darting toward the living room where he sat with his evening drink. Better not draw attention to yourself. I grew up learning to diminish myself to avoid causing trouble. When I won an award at school, I hid it. When I learned something new that excited me, I kept it to myself. It was safer to be invisible, to be less than I was. But that wasn't enough for Thomas. The more I tried to hide, the more he seemed to hate me, as if my very existence was a personal offense. During rare moments when we were alone, his true feelings would surface. You've always been the favorite, haven't you? He cornered me in our shared bedroom one evening, his voice low enough that our parents wouldn't hear from the living room. Perfect Margaret Mommy's little flower. That's not true, Thomas, I pleaded, backing toward the door. Dad clearly prefers you. Shut up. He came closer, his face inches from mine, eyes burning with something that frightened me more than my father's drunken rages. One day, they'll see who you really are, and when they do, his small hand reached out, fingers wrapping around my wrist with surprising strength. When they do, no one will want you anymore. I didn't understand. I hadn't done anything to deserve such hatred. On the contrary, I tried to please him in every way. I let him have my toys, gave up my spot in front of the TV, shared my candy. Nothing helped. Things worsened dramatically when I turned 12 and Thomas was 7. My father's drinking increased along with his late-night absences and unpredictable rages. The arguments between my parents, previously contained behind bedroom doors, spilled over into every corner of our home. You think I don't know where you've been, Anthony? My mother's voice rose one night, cracking with emotion. The sound of her palm slamming against the kitchen counter made me jump. The whole town is talking. Shut your mouth, woman. The deep rumble of my father's response sent ice down my spine. If you were a real wife, I wouldn't need to look elsewhere for what I don't have at home. Something shattered a plate or glass thrown against the wall. And what about your children? Does it matter to you what example you're setting? His laugh cold and cruel. The boy will be fine. It's that girl you're turning into a problem. On nights like these, I would take Thomas to our shared bedroom, shut the door, and turn on the small radio to drown out the sounds. Despite his usual hostility, he would allow himself to be comforted, then small and frightened in my arms as we huddled under blankets. Are they going to get divorced? He whispered, once his breath warm against my shoulder. I don't know, I answered honestly. Would that be so bad? He pulled away, staring at me with sudden intensity. Yes, then we'd have to choose sides. Who would you choose, Margaret? The question carried weight beyond his years. Mom, I guess. Wouldn't you? His eyes hardened. I'd stay with Dad. He needs me more. It was on one of those stormy nights, not of rain, but of screams and violence that everything fell apart completely. My father came home drunker than usual. The front door crashed against the wall as he stumbled in past midnight. My mother, exhausted from years of suffering, finally broke. Either you change, Anthony, or I'm leaving and taking the children. She threatened, standing in the middle of the living room, in her nightgown, arms crossed protectively over her chest. He swayed slightly, eyes narrowing to slits. You're not taking my children anywhere. Watch me. She turned toward the hallway where I stood frozen, having crept out of bed at the commotion. Margaret, pack a bag for you and your brother. We're going to Grandma's tonight. I'll never forget the sound of his hand against her face. The sharp crack, followed by the dull thud of her body falling against the coffee table. Blood trickled from the corner of her mouth as she looked up at him in shock. "Mom!" My scream pierced the silence that followed. That night, we slept at my maternal grandmother's house. Thomas cried the entire way there, not from fear for our mother, whose lip was swollen and split, but from being taken away from our father. The next morning, my mother made her decision. She packed our clothes in 2 old suitcases and announced we would move to Atlanta, where her sister had a larger house and could take us in. That's when the second blow came. "I want to stay with Daddy." Thomas declared, his small frame rigid with determination as he stood in my grandmother's living room. He looked past our mother to where my father waited on the porch, sober and remorseful, as he always was after his drinking binges. "Son, come with Mommy and your sister," my mother pleaded, kneeling to look him in the eyes. "It will be better for all of us there." "No." He jerked away from her reaching hands. "Let Margaret go. I'm staying with Daddy." Tears streamed down his face as he ran to my father, clinging to his leg. My father, seeing an opportunity to hurt my mother even more, seized the moment. "The boy wants to stay with me, Josephine, and he will. If you want to leave with the girl, that's your problem." That's how our family broke in half, my mother and I, heading to Atlanta, my father and brother staying in the small town where it all began. The farewell was quick and painful. Thomas didn't even look at me when I got on the bus. My father just gave a dry nod of his head, and off we went, 2 wounded women to start over somewhere else. The first months in Atlanta were difficult but somehow lighter, as if we'd shed a weight we hadn't fully acknowledged carrying. My Aunt Constance welcomed us with open arms to her house in the Kirkwood neighborhood, a simple home, but larger than ours, with a yard full of flowering plants and a small chicken coop that immediately fascinated me. "This is your home now," she said, showing me to a small bedroom with yellow curtains and a patchwork quilt. "You can put your books there, hang your clothes here. Make it yours, Margaret." My mother got a job at the same school where my aunt worked, and I was enrolled there too. For the first time, I didn't have to worry about hiding my good grades or letting someone win on purpose. I could simply be myself. "You're such a smart girl, Margaret," my new teacher, Ms. Elisa, would say, returning my essay with an A+ circled in red. "You have a bright future ahead of you." And I believed it. For the first time, I truly believed I could be someone, do something important with my life. Gradually, news of my father and Thomas became rarer. A phone call at Christmas, a message brought by someone who passed through our hometown. We learned that my father had found a new girlfriend, that Thomas was doing well in school, that life went on without us. I missed my brother despite everything. I kept mental notes of things to tell him when we would see each other again, about the Atlanta farmers market that left me open-mouthed the first time, about the goat my aunt raised in her backyard, about the new friends I'd made at school. I hoped that with distance that hatred would have dissipated. I imagined reunion scenarios where Thomas would run to hug me, where we would laugh about old times, carefully editing out the dark parts. But deep down, I knew better. 3 years passed like this in a peaceful routine of school, household chores, and small joys. I was 15 now, becoming a young lady, as my aunt said. I started getting interested in hairstyling, makeup, the boys on the street, normal things for my age. That's when we received news that would change everything again. My father had fallen ill, something with his liver, a consequence of years of heavy drinking. He was bedridden, needing care. The call came on a Tuesday evening, my grandmother's voice crackling over the long-distance line. "Anthony's asking for both of you," she said, her voice thin with age and worry. "The doctor doesn't think he has much time left." After hanging up, my mother sat at the kitchen table staring at nothing for a long time. Finally, she turned to me. "We need to go see him, honey," she said, her face contorted in a mix of concern and resentment. Despite everything, he's your father. And so, on a Sunday in July 1972, we took the bus back to our hometown. My stomach knotted with anxiety, my hands sweaty with nervousness. I didn't know how it would be to see my father again after so long, and especially, I didn't know how it would be to see Thomas now, 10 years old at the height of boyhood. What I didn't imagine was that trip, that family reunion, would be the beginning of my true nightmare. A nightmare no 15-year-old girl should ever have to experience. The bus dropped us off at the small station around 9 in the morning. The familiar smell of dry earth and flowering dogwoods hit me like a physical force. It was as if time hadn't passed there, the same whitewashed houses, the same central square, with the peeling bandstand, the same cloudless blue Georgia sky stretching overhead like a judgment. We went straight to my paternal grandmother's house where my father had been living since he fell ill. Thomas was with him, of course. My heart hammered in my chest with such force I thought it would break my ribs. How would it be to see my little brother after 3 years? Would he still hate me with the same intensity? Or would time and distance have softened that childish grudge? My grandmother's house sat on the upper part of town, an old construction with thick walls and blue-painted windows that seemed to watch us approach like wary eyes. When we arrived, my grandmother Dolores greeted us at the door, more aged than I remembered, her face mapped with deep wrinkles that told stories of recent worry. "Josephine Margaret," she said without warmth, embracing us briefly. "Good that you came. Anthony is in the living room lying on the sofa. The doctor said he shouldn't stay in bed too much during the day. It's bad for his lungs." We entered the cool, dark living room, lace curtains filtering the strong morning light. And there he was, my father lying on a sofa covered with white sheets. He was unrecognizable. The strong and intimidating man of my childhood had transformed into a yellowed skeleton, his eyes sunken in purple circles, his unshaven beard highlighting the thinness of his face. "You really came," he said, his voice a weak rasp that didn't match at all the booming authority I remembered. My mother approached first cautious, as one might approach an unfamiliar dog. "We came as soon as we heard Anthony. How are you feeling?" Like a man who drank his whole life and is now paying the price. He answered with a bitter smile that revealed yellowed teeth. His eyes shifted to me, and something in them made my skin crawl despite his weakened state. "Margaret, come here. Let me see you properly. You've turned into a young lady." I approached, my heart still racing. Up close, the smell of illness was stronger, a mix of medicines and old sweat that made me nauseous. Still, I leaned in when he extended his hand to touch my face. His fingers were cold and trembling against my cheek. "You're pretty like your mother," he murmured, his eyes traveling down my body in a way that made me want to wrap my arms around myself. "Thomas will be happy to see you." He had barely pronounced these words when we heard the back door slam. Quick footsteps crossed the kitchen, and then he appeared in the living room, my brother. Only he was no longer the little boy I had left behind. He was taller, of course, but there was something else, something in his eyes that caused me to shiver instantly. They were my father's eyes now looking out from a child's face. He stood in the doorway holding a half-eaten mango juice running down his fingers and wrist. "Mom, Margaret." His voice was caught between childhood and the first hints of adolescence. "Thomas, my son." My mother opened her arms, tears in her eyes. He came to us first, hugging my mother tightly, then stopping in front of me. I hesitated, not knowing if I should hug him or not. He resolved it for me, giving me a quick, stiff embrace that felt more like an assessment than affection. "You're different," he said, analyzing me from head to toe with a gaze too adult for his years. "You too," I responded, uncomfortable with his scrutiny. My grandmother announced she was going to prepare lunch, that we should make ourselves at home. My mother offered to help, and the two went to the kitchen, leaving me in the living room with my father and brother. The silence that followed was suffocating. My father closed his eyes, seeming exhausted just from receiving us. Thomas continued staring at me in that strange way until he finally spoke. "Come see my car collection," he said abruptly. "It's grown a lot since you left." I followed him down the hallway to what had been my father's childhood bedroom and now belonged to Thomas. It was a small room with a window that looked out onto the backyard. The narrow bed was covered with a patchwork quilt, and on the shelves, dozens of metal cars were perfectly aligned by size and color. "They're nice," I commented, genuinely impressed with the collection. "You take good care of them. Dad gives me one every time we go to the big city," he said, obvious pride in his voice. He selected a red Corvette, holding it up to the light. "He says, I'm the son who stayed that I deserve presents." The barb was clear, but I decided to ignore it. I hadn't come all this way to fight with a 10-year-old. "Tell me about school, your friends." I tried sitting carefully on the edge of his bed. He shrugged, picking up another car and spinning its wheels with his finger. "Normal. I'm the best in the class now." He raised his eyes to me, challenging. "Dad says you took all the family intelligence when you left, but he was wrong." I tried a few more conversations, all received with the same coldness. After a while, I gave up and suggested we return to the living room. That's when he grabbed me by the arm, his fingers digging into my flesh with surprising strength for a 10-year-old boy. "Why did you come back?" he hissed, his face suddenly inches from mine. "We were fine without you." The venom in his voice frightened me. "We came to see Dad Thomas. He's sick. He was sick with missing you all this time, and you never came," he accused, twisting my arm slightly. "Now that he's dying, you show up. For what?" I didn't know what to respond. How could I explain to a child the complexities of a failed marriage, of a painful separation? How could I tell him we were afraid of what my father might do if we had appeared before? "I'm sorry," was all I managed to say. "Sorry for having left." Something passed across his face, a shadow, a tremor. For an instant, I thought I saw the little boy I had left behind, vulnerable and frightened. But it passed quickly, replaced by that mask of hostility. "Too late for apologies," he replied, releasing me with a small shove. "Let's go back before they miss us." Lunch was served at the large dining room table covered with a crocheted tablecloth that my grandmother only used on special occasions. My father was helped to the table, supported on Thomas's shoulder, who seemed proud of this caretaker role. We ate in silence, broken only by superficial conversations about the weather, about acquaintances from town, about things that didn't matter. After lunch, my mother and grandmother went to wash the dishes. My father said he needed to lie down a bit, that the food had made him drowsy. Thomas offered to help him to the bedroom, and the two left the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I got up to look at the photographs on the wall, old family pictures I barely recognized. In one, my young and smiling parents held a baby me newly born. In another, my father in a football team uniform, proud and strong. It was strange to see those images of happiness, knowing how the story had continued. I was so absorbed in the photographs that I didn't hear the footsteps behind me. When a hand touched my shoulder, I jumped, my heart lurching to my throat. "Calm down, it's me," said my father, who suddenly didn't seem as fragile as minutes before. He stood straighter, his breathing less labored. I took an instinctive step back. "I thought Thomas was helping you lie down." "Thomas went to get my medicine at the pharmacy," he replied, taking a step toward me, closing the distance I had created. His eyes had changed, the cloudy illness replaced by something predatory. "I wanted some time alone with you." Something in his voice alerted me. It wasn't the tone of a father who wanted to talk with his daughter. It was something darker, more menacing. I glanced toward the kitchen, where I could hear water running and dishes clattering. "Mom and Grandma are in the kitchen," I said, my voice coming out higher than normal. "I can call them to help you." "No need to bother them," he interrupted, taking another step forward. "You're a young lady now. You can help me by yourself." What happened next is still difficult to tell, even after so many years. His hand, that should have been resting on my shoulder for support, moved downward, touching where it shouldn't. His mouth murmured horrible things in my ear as he pushed me toward his bedroom. The smell of illness mixed with the unmistakable scent of whiskey he had been drinking in secret even while sick. "Stop, Dad, please!" I begged, trying to break free, panic growing inside me like a tidal wave. "You look so much like your mother when she was young," he continued as if he hadn't heard me. His fingers tightened painfully on my arm. "But you're prettier. You were always my favorite." I struggled against his grip, my mind reeling with confusion and horror. This was my father, the man who should protect me from the world's dangers, not become one of them. When I finally managed to wrench myself free and run for the door, it opened before I reached it. It was Thomas returning from the pharmacy. He stood in the doorway, a small white bag in his hand, his eyes moving from my panicked face to our father behind me. "Margaret, what's going on?" he asked, his voice suddenly younger than it had been all day. "Nothing, son," replied my father with frightening naturalness. "Your sister was just helping me lie down, but you can continue from here." I took the opportunity to escape hurriedly, pushing past Thomas, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I ran to the bathroom at the end of the hallway, locked the door, and collapsed onto the floor, shaking uncontrollably. What had just happened? Had I misunderstood? Was I exaggerating? But I knew in the depths of my soul that I wasn't. My father's intentions had been as clear as glass. I stayed in that bathroom long enough to regain some control, to wash my face, to convince myself that I could face the rest of that day. When I came out, the house seemed quiet. I could still hear my mother and grandmother in the kitchen. I decided to go there to stay near them, where I would feel safe. I was passing through the living room when Thomas appeared again, blocking my path. His face was too serious for his 10 years. "We need to talk," he said in a low voice, glancing toward the kitchen. "Not now, Thomas." I tried to move past him. "I need to talk to Mom. It's about Dad," he persisted, grabbing my wrist. "What he did to you?" I froze in place, staring at him. Had he seen? Did he understand what had almost happened? "It's not the first time," Thomas continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean?" My blood turned to ice in my veins. His eyes darted around, making sure we weren't overheard. "He does this with the girls from the neighborhood, promises candy toys. Some come here when Grandma's out. I see everything through the door crack." The horror of what he was saying hit me like a physical blow. My father, a predator of children, and Thomas knew, observed. "Why have you never told anyone?" I asked, my voice barely recognizable to my own ears. He shrugged, a terribly adult gesture on such small shoulders. "He's my dad, and the girls always come back, so I guess they don't mind." I was dealing with a child who had been corrupted, whose sense of right and wrong had been completely distorted by the man who should have protected him. A wave of pity flooded me, along with an even greater fear. "Thomas, this is wrong. Very wrong. We need to tell someone. Grandma, Mom." It was then that he smiled a smile I will never forget as long as I live. It transformed his childish face into something else entirely. Something that didn't belong in this world. "I know it's wrong," he said softly. "And I know something else, too." "What?" I whispered, unable to look away from that smile. "Dad told me you abandoned us because you thought I was stupid and ugly, that you laughed at me behind my back, that you prayed every night for me to die." My blood froze in my veins. "That's a lie, Thomas. I never—" "He wouldn't lie to me," Thomas interrupted, his voice hardening. "He stayed with me when you and Mom left." And before I could process what was happening, he took a step forward and put his hand on my chest in the same way my father had done minutes before. "And now I'm going to show you that I'm not that weak little boy anymore," he whispered, eyes gleaming with something terrible. "That I've learned a lot from Dad in these years. I won't describe in detail what followed. Some memories are too heavy to put into words. I will only say that in that dark hallway, my own brother, a 10-year-old child, tried to do to me what he had certainly seen our father do to other girls. The shock was so great that for several seconds I was paralyzed, unable to react. It was only when I heard my mother's voice calling my name that I managed to move away, pushing Thomas forcefully against the wall.
What's going on here? My mother asked sharply, appearing at the kitchen door, drying her hands on a dish towel.
I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. How do you tell your mother that both your father and brother had just tried to molest you? How do you put that horror into words?
Nothing, Mom.
I began, my voice breaking.
Margaret was showing me how to kiss.
Thomas interjected with frightening naturalness.
She said she was going to teach me grown-up things.
The horrified look my mother gave me when she turned to me is something I will never forget. The doubt in her eyes, the uncertainty about who to believe. It's not true, Mom. I pleaded, tears finally breaking through. He's lying. He and Dad, I couldn't finish. How to explain the inexplicable?
Go to the kitchen, Thomas.
My mother ordered, her voice trembling. He obeyed, not without first giving me a look of triumph that clearly said, "See, no one will believe you." When we were alone, my mother gripped my arms, looking at me intensely.
What really happened, Margaret? She demanded. And don't come to me with lies.
Something in her firmness gave me courage. I told her everything, the words coming in a torrent. What my father had tried to do, what Thomas had said about other girls, what he himself had tried to do to me. With each word, my mother's face grew paler, more rigid. When I finished, she was shaking as much as I was.
My daughter,
she whispered, hugging me tightly.
My daughter, forgive me. I should have guessed, should have suspected.
In that embrace, I felt that she believed me, and that made all the difference.
We are leaving right now,
she said determinedly, wiping tears from her cheeks.
I'll get our things. Don't stay alone for a minute. Come with me.
But before we could leave the room, my father appeared at the bedroom door, Thomas at his side. The two looked like a distorted version of the same being, the older teaching the younger how to be a monster.
Where are you going in such a hurry?
My father asked, his voice slurred. The illness that had seemed so debilitating earlier now appeared secondary to his malice. The visit has barely begun. My mother stood in front of me, a lioness protecting her cub.
We've seen enough, Anthony,
she said, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. And you should be ashamed of yourself. I saw my father advance, staggering but determined. I saw Thomas following his example, his face contorted into a mask of childish hatred. The front door seemed miles away. We were cornered.
And then, like an answer to a prayer I hadn't even had time to formulate, the front door opened with a bang, making everyone freeze in place. A tall, strong figure entered the room, wearing the blue uniform that inspired as much respect as fear in those days. It was my uncle Augustus, my mother's brother, the military man. His presence filled the room like sudden thunder, his eyes quickly scanning the scene before him, my mother protectively in front of me, my father and Thomas frozen like statues, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife.
Josephine, Margaret.
His voice resonated firmly as he closed the door behind him.
Augustus. My mother breathed relief, washing over her face.
Thank God you came.
My father, momentarily destabilized by the unexpected arrival, recovered his bravado. This is my house, military man. You have no right to enter like this. My wife and daughter are visiting me. It's a family matter. The look my uncle gave my father was like lightning cutting through a stormy sky. In it were decades of mistrust, of stories heard in whispers, of suspicions never confirmed until that moment.
Josephine, get your things,
he ordered, not taking his eyes off my father.
We're leaving now.
It was then that Thomas,
That 10-year-old boy, whose heart had already been poisoned beyond salvation, decided to show his loyalty to the man who had corrupted him. "They can't go," he shouted, moving to stand beside my father. "Margaret was doing things to me. She started it, didn't she, Dad?" The accusation hung in the air for a second before I found my voice. That's a lie." I cried out, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. "It was him and Dad who tried to attack me." The tension in the room was so dense that I felt as if I couldn't breathe properly. My grandmother, Dolores, appeared at the kitchen door, confused by the tumult, drying her hands on her apron. "What's happening here?" she demanded. "Augustus, what are you doing here?" My uncle didn't respond to my grandmother. Instead, he took a step forward, his eyes never leaving my father, who instinctively backed away. "Josephine telegraphed me yesterday," he explained, his voice controlled but vibrating with anger. "Asked me to come because she was worried about meeting you, Anthony. It seems she had reason to be concerned." He then turned to me, and for the first time, I noticed how his eyes, despite the hardness of the rest of his face, were gentle like my mother's. "Margaret, what happened here?" he asked softly. "Can you tell me?" I felt the gazes upon me, the weight of that moment, the choice I had to make. If I told the truth, I would expose not only my father, but also my brother, would destroy what was left of our family. If I kept quiet, who knows what else could happen with how many other girls. Courage came from a place I didn't know existed within me. I looked directly at my uncle and told him everything about my father's hands where they shouldn't be, about Thomas's words revealing that this happened with other neighborhood girls, about how my own brother had tried to imitate his father with me. As I spoke, I saw my uncle Augustus's face transform. The mask of military control broke, revealing a fury so deep, so visceral, that it made me take a step back. "You monster," he murmured, turning slowly to my father. "You disgusting monster." What followed was so fast that I have only flashes in my memory. My uncle advancing on my father, the sound of fists meeting flesh, my father staggering backwards, falling onto the living room table. Thomas screaming, trying to defend his father, being pushed away with a shove that sent him to the other side of the room. My mother pulled me to the back of the house, protecting me from the chaos that had erupted. I heard my grandmother begging them to stop, heard the noise of furniture breaking, of glass shattering. "Mom, Uncle is going to kill him," I whispered, terrified by the violence I had unleashed. "Your uncle knows what he's doing," she replied, her voice strangely calm now. "He won't kill anyone. He's just doing what should have been done long ago." Minutes later, that seemed like hours, my uncle appeared at the door. His impeccable uniform was now wrinkled. There was blood on the sleeve and cuff of his shirt, but his eyes were calm again, as if the fury had been completely exorcised. "Everything is under control," he said. "Get your things. We're leaving." "And Dad and Thomas?" I asked, still trembling. A hard smile appeared at the corner of my uncle's mouth. "Your father is alive, if that's what you want to know. Maybe with some broken bones, but alive." "And my brother?" He hesitated, as if choosing his words. "Your brother has many problems ahead of him, but don't worry about them now." When we returned to the living room, my father was lying on the couch, his face unrecognizable under the bruises that were beginning to form. Blood trickled from his nose and mouth. Thomas was sitting on the floor, huddled in a corner, his eyes wide with fear. My grandmother was beside my father, cleaning the blood with a damp cloth, murmuring words I couldn't understand. No one stopped us when we picked up our small suitcases and headed for the door. Before leaving, however, my uncle stopped and turned to my father. "I'll be watching you, Anthony," he warned, his voice low and dangerous. "One wrong move, one single complaint about you approaching any child, and I'll come back to finish what I started today. Understand?" My father didn't respond, just moaned softly. "And as for you, boy," my uncle continued, addressing Thomas, still in the corner, "there's still time for you not to become like your father. Think about that." The journey from that house to the bus station was made in heavy silence.
My uncle drove a borrowed military jeep, my mother beside him, me in the back seat, hugging my suitcase as if it were a shield. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, relief that we had escaped shame for what had happened, worry about what would come next. At the bus station, my uncle finally broke the silence.
"You can't go back to Atlanta," he said, looking directly at my mother. "It's not safe. Anthony might want revenge when he recovers."
"Where will we go then?" My mother asked, her voice small and tired.
"To Norfolk with me. I have space in the apartment. It's not much, but it has 2 bedrooms. You take mine. I'll sleep in the living room until we find something better."
And so instead of returning to Atlanta, we boarded a bus to Norfolk, Virginia, leaving behind not only that small town, but also the last illusions about the possibility of a family reconciliation. The journey was long and silent. I looked out the bus window, watching the dry landscape of rural Georgia gradually transform into the greener valleys that announced the proximity of the coast. I felt as if each mile distanced us not only geographically, but also emotionally from that nightmare. Norfolk welcomed us with its peculiar light reflected in the waters of the many rivers and the bay. It was a big city, noisy, full of life and possibilities. My uncle's apartment was in an old building in the Ghent neighborhood near the base where he served. It was small, as he had warned, but clean and organized with military precision. That first night, after my mother finally fell asleep, exhausted in the borrowed bedroom, I stayed in the living room with my uncle. He had prepared the sofa to sleep on, but was still sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of black coffee in his hand, his gaze lost on the wall. "Uncle," I called, softly approaching. "Thank you for today, for believing me." He looked at me as if he had forgotten I was there. Then his face softened a little.
"No need to thank me, Margaret. I only did what any decent man would do."
I sat across from him, my hands restless in my lap. "What will happen now? With my father and brother, I mean."
He sighed, running his hand over his tired face. "Your father will be reported," he said finally. "I have friends in the police. I'll make sure they investigate the case of the other girls your brother mentioned."
"And Thomas?" I pressed. He hesitated.
"He's a child who was poisoned by his own father, but still a child. Maybe with the right help he can change."
"Do you think he can really change after what he tried to do?"
My uncle looked at me for a long moment before answering.
"I don't know, Margaret," he said honestly. "I'd like to say yes, that everyone can be saved with love and proper guidance. But the truth is that some seeds fall on fertile soil, others on rocky ground. Only time will tell what kind of man your brother will become." That conversation was etched in my memory. My uncle's honesty, his refusal to offer me false guarantees, was strangely comforting. It was as if, after years of living among half-truths and complete lies, someone was finally treating me as someone capable of facing reality, however harsh it might be. In the days that followed, we gradually adapted to life in Norfolk. My uncle helped my mother find work at a public school, and I was enrolled in the nearby high school. Life began to take on a new routine, a new normality, but inside, I was far from normal. The nightmares began almost immediately. Vivid dreams where my father and Thomas chased me down dark corridors, where hands emerged from the walls to grab me, where I screamed for help, and no one heard. I would wake up sweating, heart racing, often screaming so loudly that I woke my mother and uncle. They would come running, turn on the light, assure me that everything was fine, that I was safe. But I didn't feel safe, not at all. During the day, I would startle at any unexpected touch. At school, I couldn't concentrate on classes. I jumped at the slightest noise, constantly looking over my shoulder, as if expecting to see my father or brother at any moment. And there was the shame, a deep, irrational shame, that made me feel dirty even after several showers, as if what had happened or almost happened had left an invisible mark on me that everyone could see. My mother noticed, of course. One night after another, particularly terrible nightmare, she sat on the edge of my bed and held my hands in hers. "It wasn't your fault, Margaret," she said, the words coming with difficulty. "Nothing that happened was your fault. The fault is theirs, only theirs. I wanted to believe her really wanted to. But the seed of doubt had already been planted, and that seed would grow in the following years, transforming into a tree of self-deprecation and self-blame that almost completely destroyed me.
My uncle kept his promise. A month after the incident, we received news that my father had been arrested. The investigation revealed that there were at least 5 other girls in town. He had molested 5 children, whose parents finally had the courage to report when they learned they weren't the only ones.
As for Thomas, he was sent to live with a paternal aunt in Charlotte. I knew from occasional letters from my grandmother that he was adapting and receiving therapy. I wanted to believe this meant he was changing, recovering from the toxic influence of our father. But a part of me always feared that wherever he was, he carried that look, that intention.
The months passed. I turned 16, then 17. Life in Norfolk had its difficulties, but also its beauties. I discovered the sea, the immense and frightening Atlantic Ocean, so different from the small lakes of the interior. I discovered the Navy festivals, the colorful and noisy crowds that took to the streets. I discovered a city that, despite all its problems, pulsed with an energy that fascinated me.
But inside, the storm continued. The nightmares, though less frequent, still came. The distrust of any man who approached, the fear of touch, the constant shame. All this remained like a shadow that faithfully follows your steps without ever letting you see its face. It was in this fragile emotional state that I entered adulthood, and it was in this state that I faced the darkest years of my existence, years that would take me so deep into the well of despair that I came to doubt if I would ever see light again. They say physical wounds heal, but those of the soul can bleed for decades without anyone noticing. I carried my invisible wounds through the streets of Norfolk, like someone carrying a cross too heavy for their shoulders. The last years of my adolescence passed in a fog of fear and confusion. I completed high school at the insistence of my mother, who repeated like a mantra, "Education is the only thing no one can take from you, my daughter." But while my classmates dreamed of universities and careers, I could only think about surviving until the next day without being swallowed by the abyss growing inside me. In 1975, at 18, I got my first job as a receptionist at a small beauty salon in downtown Norfolk. It didn't pay much, but it was enough to help with expenses and give me some independence. My mother continued teaching. My uncle Augustus had been transferred to Washington, D.C., and we had found a fragile balance in that improvised life. It was at the salon that I discovered my affinity with hair. I watched fascinated as the hairdressers transformed ordinary women into queens with just a cut, a blowout, a dye job. In my free moments, I asked to practice on mannequins, learning techniques, memorizing color combinations, mastering the use of each tool. You have talent, girl," said Miss Celia, the owner, an energetic middle-aged woman who dyed her hair an impossible red. "Your hands know what they're doing. You should take the professional course." And so I did. I saved every penny for almost a year until I could pay for the technical hairdressing course. It was good to have something to focus all my energy on, something that didn't involve thinking about the past or fearing the future. When I had the scissors in my hand working on a client's hair, there was only the present moment, the texture under my fingers, the challenge of creating something beautiful. But when the salon door closed at the end of the day, when I returned to the apartment that now my mother and I shared alone, the darkness returned, a darkness that not even the city lights could dispel. The nightmares hadn't ceased. Now they were less frequent, but more intense. I would wake up screaming, my body drenched in sweat, my throat hurting from the effort of fighting ghosts that only I saw. My mother, exhausted after years of dealing with my night terrors, could no longer comfort me as before. "Maybe you should talk to someone, Margaret," she would suggest, her eyes marked by deep circles. "A doctor? A psychologist?" But how to explain the inexplicable to a stranger?
How to put into words the sensation of being dirty inside, corrupted by something I hadn't even completely experienced. Besides, at that time in the mid-70s, seeking psychological help still carried a heavy stigma. It was practically admitting you were crazy. So instead of seeking help, I sought escape, and I found it initially in the arms of a man who seemed different from all the others, who didn't immediately trigger my fear response. Charles was a client at the salon where I worked, a bank employee, always well-dressed, educated with a gentle smile. He was the first man who didn't cause me that immediate sense of alert, that desire to run in the opposite direction. We started dating when I was 19. At first, he was patient with my fears, with my reluctance for any more intimate physical contact. He waited 3 months until I allowed our first kiss, 6 more, until I let his hand slide beyond my waist. "I understand that you need time," he would say, caressing my face with a delicacy that made me believe that maybe, just maybe not, all men were like my father and brother. Our relationship progressed slowly. At 20, I thought I was finally ready for true intimacy, that I had overcome my traumas, that I could be a normal woman with normal desires. I was wrong. The first time we tried to make love, I froze completely. My body became rigid as stone, tears flooded my eyes, and I began to shake uncontrollably. Charles stopped immediately, confused and concerned. "Margaret, what's wrong?" he asked, moving away from me. "Did I hurt you?" I couldn't respond. How to explain that it wasn't him, but the ghosts of my past that were terrorizing me? How to tell about my father, about Thomas, without him looking at me with disgust, or worse, with pity? I made up excuses, said I was nervous, that it was my first time, that I needed more time. He accepted, understanding as always. But after that episode, something changed between us. A distance set in, imperceptible at first, but growing each day. 2 months later, he ended our relationship. "It's not fair to you or to me," he explained, avoiding my gaze. "You're clearly not ready for a relationship, and I need to move on with my life." It was as if a dagger were thrust into my chest. The rejection brought to the surface all my worst fears, that I was irreparably broken, that I would never be loved, that what my father and Thomas had done or tried to do had marked me forever with a kind of invisible curse. In the months that followed, I sank into a deep depression. I went to work, mechanically returned home, locked myself in my room, barely ate, barely slept. When I managed to fall asleep, the nightmares were so violent that I would wake up screaming. My nails dug into my own palms with such force that they left marks for days. My mother, desperate, didn't know what to do anymore. She even called my uncle in D.C., begging for help. He suggested she take me to a military hospital where he had contacts where they might be able to help me. But I vehemently refused. The fear of being institutionalized, of being labeled as crazy, was greater than the desire to rid myself of that pain. It was at this time, at the bottom of the well, that I found another form of escape: alcohol. It started innocently with a glass of wine to help me sleep. Soon it progressed to an entire bottle, then to stronger drinks, whiskey, rum, whatever was available, and cheap enough for my salary, increasingly compromised by my new addiction. Drinking didn't solve the problems, but it blurred them enough for me to function. It was like putting a bandage over an infected wound. It didn't cure, just hid the problem that continued to rot underneath. In 1978, at 21, I lost my job at the salon. I arrived late once, twice, 3 times. I showed up drunk on a Tuesday morning. Miss Celia, who had been so good to me, called me to the small office at the back of the salon. "Margaret, you know, I like you like a daughter," she said, her voice heavy with disappointment. "But I can't allow this anymore. You need help, not a job." I left there devastated, but not surprised. Part of me knew I was in a downward spiral, that each day was worse than the previous one, that I was slowly and methodically self-destructing. In the years that followed, I strung one odd job after another. I worked as a cleaner, as a street vendor, as a kitchen helper. Nothing lasted more than a few months,
The alcohol always won, always pulled me back into the abyss. My mother, who had been my safe harbor for so long, began to wither before my eyes. The stress of seeing me in that state, the impotence of not being able to help me, were undermining her health. In 1980, when I was 23, she suffered a stroke that left her partially paralyzed on the left side. Suddenly, the roles were reversed. Now, it was I who needed to take care of her. I swear I tried with all my might. For a few weeks, I stayed sober, took on responsibilities, did the best I could. But the pressure was too great. The guilt was crushing. And soon, I went back to drinking. A kind neighbor, Mrs. Eunice, began to help with my mother when she realized I wasn't in a condition to do so. She would come in the morning, give her a bath, prepare food, stay until I returned from work when I had work. "Your mother doesn't deserve this, my child," she said to me one afternoon when she found me staggering in the apartment hallway. "And neither do you. You're young, beautiful, have a whole life ahead of you." I laughed in her face, a bitter laugh that contained all my despair. A whole life ahead of me. I spat out the words like poison. What kind of life, one, where every shadow reminds me of my father, where every man who crosses my path makes me think of my brother, where the simple act of existing is a daily torture? It was on a dawn in 1982, after losing yet another job and drinking until I lost consciousness, that I hit rock bottom. I woke up on the bathroom floor, surrounded by my own vomit, not remembering how I had gotten there. The broken mirror above the sink reflected a stranger tangled hair, sunken eyes, yellowish skin, cracked lips, a 25-year-old woman who looked 45. That morning, in a clarity that only comes when there is nothing more to lose, I made a decision. I didn't want to live like this anymore. I couldn't live like this anymore. I climbed to the roof of our building, an 8-story building in downtown Norfolk. It was early, the sun had barely risen, and the city was beginning to awaken below me. The noise of the first buses of shops, opening of life that continued implacably without caring about my pain. I approached the edge, feeling the cold morning wind on my face. I wasn't afraid. For the first time in years, I didn't feel fear, just a kind of resigned peace, an end to the suffering. I was ready to take the last step when a voice behind me made me freeze. "Miss, don't do that." I turned slowly. It was the building's janitor, Mr. Manuel, an elderly gentleman with hands calloused from hard work and kind eyes that had seen more of life than I would ever see. "Go away, Mr. Manuel," I said, my voice cracked and weak. "Leave me in peace." He took a cautious step toward me. "I can't do that, Miss Margaret. I can't let a young woman like you throw away the gift of life." "What gift?" I laughed bitterly, the wind carrying away the sound. "My life is nothing but pain." "Pain passes," he said simply. "I know, because I've had my share. But if you jump, there's no coming back. No chance for things to get better." He extended his weathered hand to me, and something in his quiet dignity, in the way he looked at me without judgment, broke through my despair. I took his hand, and he led me away from the edge, down the stairs, back to our apartment. That same day, Mrs. Eunice and Mr. Manuel took me to my first Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. I went unwillingly, convinced it wouldn't help, that nothing could help someone as broken as me. I sat in the back of that church basement, arms crossed, defiant, waiting for the meeting to end so I could return to my bottle. But then something happened that changed everything. A woman stood up to share her story. A woman in her 50s, well-dressed, composed, with intelligent eyes and a gentle smile. She spoke of her own childhood abuse, of years lost to alcohol, of a suicide attempt that almost succeeded. "I thought I was beyond saving," she said, her voice steady. "I thought the damage was permanent, that I would never be more than the terrible things that happened to me. But I was wrong." I sat up straighter, suddenly alert. This woman could have been telling my story,
And yet there she stood 10 years sober with a job, friends, a life worth living. The hardest thing, she continued, was forgiving myself for things that were never my fault to begin with. Accepting that I deserved happiness despite everything. I left that meeting with something I hadn't felt in years, a tiny spark of hope. Maybe I wasn't beyond saving either. The road to recovery was long and brutally difficult. There were days when I thought I couldn't make it, when the craving for alcohol was so strong that my whole body shook with it. There were nights when the nightmares returned with such violence that I woke up screaming, convinced that my father and Thomas were in the room with me. But I had help now. I had my AA sponsor, Miss Rita, a former nurse with a no-nonsense attitude and infinite patience. I had Mrs. Eunice, who continued to help with my mother, and who believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. I had Mr. Manuel, who checked on me every day, who brought me coffee on mornings when getting out of bed seemed an impossible feat. And I had, finally, a therapist. With my uncle's help, I got into a program for survivors of sexual abuse, where I met Dr. Carson, a woman with quiet intelligence and bottomless compassion. In her office for the first time, I was able to truly speak about what had happened to me, not just the events in themselves, but how they had shaped me, how they had distorted my vision of myself and the world. "You are not what happened to you, Margaret," she would repeat like a mantra. "You are what you choose to become, in spite of what happened to you." Those therapy sessions were often unbearable. There were days when I left Dr. Carson's office so emotionally drained that I could barely walk back to the bus stop. But slowly, painfully slowly, I began to heal. The nightmares became less frequent. The constant shame began to lift. The fear didn't disappear completely, but it became manageable, no longer dictating my every decision. In 1983, a year into my sobriety, we received news that my father had died in prison. Liver cirrhosis, the final revenge of the alcohol that had fueled his cruelty. I felt nothing when my mother told me no sadness, no relief, just a strange emptiness where fear had once lived. "What about Thomas?" I asked, realizing I hadn't thought about my brother in months. "Your grandmother says he's doing well," my mother replied. "He finished high school last year, plans to join the army." I nodded, hoping it was true, hoping the years with his aunt and the therapy had changed him, had given him a chance to be something other than what our father had tried to make him. 2 years sober. I was working again as a hairdresser, this time in a larger salon in downtown Norfolk. My hands had regained their steadiness, my eye for color and shape had returned. I was good at what I did, really good, and clients began to request me specifically. It was one of these clients, a woman named Eleanor, who split her time between Norfolk and Savannah, who changed my life once again. "I have a proposition for you, Margaret," she said one day as I was finishing her highlights. "I own a small salon in Savannah. My hairdresser is retiring, moving to be closer to her grandchildren. I need someone to take over." I nearly dropped my scissors. "Me? But I've never managed a salon before." "You have talent," she said simply. "And something more important, empathy. Women tell you their problems while you do their hair. You listen. That's rare." It was true. Over the years, I had become a kind of informal therapist for my clients. Something about the intimate act of having someone touch your hair made people open up, share their secrets, their fears, their hopes. And I listened, really listened, because I knew what it was like to need someone to hear you. "Think about it," Eleanor said as she left. "The offer stands." I did think about it. For days I turned the idea over in my mind. Savannah was far from Norfolk, far from my mother, from my support system. But it was also a fresh start, a place where no one knew my story, where I wouldn't be that alcoholic girl, or poor Margaret with the troubled past. When I discussed it with my mother, she surprised me. "Go," she said firmly. "I'll be fine. Mrs. Eunice has offered me the extra room in her apartment. It will be better for both of us." "But Mom, your health is stable," she interrupted. "And you need this, Margaret. You need to build your own life, not just care for an old woman." "You're not old," I protested. She smiled, touching my cheek with her good hand. Old enough to know that children need to fly from the nest. It's time for you to fly, my daughter. And so in the fall of 1984, at 27 years old, I moved to Savannah, Georgia, to take over a small salon called Daisy's in the historic district. I found a room to rent in a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Taylor, who reminded me of Mrs. Eunice. I connected with the local AA chapter, finding a new sponsor in Miss Rita, a former school teacher with a booming laugh and no-nonsense attitude. The first months were hard, as any major change is. I missed my mother, missed the familiarity of Norfolk, the security of my support system there. But I also discovered a joy and independence in building something with my own hands. The salon was small but charming, with large windows that let in the golden Savannah light. I painted the walls a soft blue, hung plants from the ceiling, created a space that felt welcoming, safe. Clients began to come, first a trickle, then a steady stream. Word spread that the new hairdresser at Daisy's had a magical touch with color, that she could look at your face and know exactly what cut would bring out your best features. But more than that, word spread that she was a good listener, that an hour in her chair was like a therapy session that left you not only looking better, but feeling better too. I didn't realize it then, but I was creating more than a business. I was creating a sanctuary, a place where women could come to be seen, to be heard, to be touched, in a way that was healing rather than harmful. In my own small way, I was turning my trauma into something positive, using the empathy born from suffering to connect with others. It was in 1986, 2 years after moving to Savannah, that I met Joseph. He owned the barbershop 2 blocks down from my salon, a traditional place with a striped pole out front and the smell of bay rum and talcum powder inside. He came to Daisy's one day, not as a client, but with a proposal. "I have a client," he explained, standing awkwardly in the middle of my salon hat in hand. "A teenage boy with long hair, wants to keep the length but needs it styled. I'm not good with long hair. Thought maybe we could work something out? I send the long-haired ones to you. You send the men who want a traditional cut to me." Joseph was in his late 30s with salt and pepper hair, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and hands that showed years of work. He was widowed. I would learn later his wife had died of cancer 5 years earlier, leaving him alone to raise their son, now away at college. Something about his quiet dignity, his lack of pretense, put me at ease immediately. We agreed to the arrangement, and over the following months, we began to exchange not just clients, but conversation. He would stop by with coffee sometimes in the morning, or I would bring him lunch when I knew he was too busy to step out. We talked about hair, about business, about the weather-safe topics, neutral ground. It was a friendship, nothing more, for almost a year. I was still too afraid, too damaged to think of romance. But Joseph was patient, persistent in his gentle way. He never pushed, never rushed, seemed content to simply be in my company. One evening, as we were both closing our shops, he invited me to dinner. I hesitated, old fears rising to the surface. He must have seen the panic in my eyes, because he quickly added, "Just as friends, Margaret. Just to talk somewhere that doesn't smell of shampoo or aftershave." I agreed, and we went to a small Italian restaurant near Forsyth Park. Over pasta and wine, for him soda water, for me, we talked, really talked for the first time. He told me about his wife, about their years together, about the cancer that took her too young. I told him about Norfolk, about my mother, about finding sobriety. I didn't tell him about my father, about Thomas, about the darkness that had nearly consumed me. Those secrets were still too heavy to share. But as the weeks passed, as our dinners became a regular thing, as his quick visits to my salon grew longer, I began to feel something I had thought impossible. Attraction, desire, the stirring of feelings I had buried so deeply, I thought they were dead. It terrified me. The closer we grew, the more I pulled back, inventing excuses to cancel plans, creating distance when he came too near. Joseph was confused, hurt by my sudden coldness. "Have I done something wrong, Margaret?" he asked one evening when I had once again cut our dinner short. No, I assured him, avoiding his gaze. "I'm just busy with the salon. He was quiet for a moment, studying my face. Then he sighed. I think there's more to it than that, but I won't press you. When you're ready to talk, I'll listen. I took my confusion to my AA sponsor, Miss Rita, who listened to my jumbled explanation with her usual calm. You're afraid? She said when I finished. Not of Joseph, but of what he represents: intimacy, vulnerability, the possibility of rejection if he knew the whole truth about you. How can I tell him? I whispered. How can I tell anyone about that the same way you told me? She replied. One word at a time, and if he's the man I think he is, he'll still be there when you're done. It took me another month to find the courage. We were walking in Forsyth Park on a Sunday afternoon, the Spanish moss swaying gently in the breeze, the fountain splashing in the distance. I stopped by a bench and asked if we could sit. My heart was racing so hard, I thought I might be sick. Joseph, I began, my voice barely audible. There's something I need to tell you, something about my past. And I told him. All of it. About my father, about Thomas, about the darkness, the alcohol, the suicide attempt, the long climb back to something resembling a normal life. I spoke without looking at him, my eyes fixed on my hands twisted in my lap, afraid of what I might see in his face: disgust, pity, rejection. When I finally fell silent, exhausted by the confession, he didn't speak for what seemed an eternity. Then gently, he took my hand in his. Thank you, he said simply. I looked up, startled. For what? For trusting me with your story. For being brave enough to share it. It doesn't change how I feel about you, Margaret. If anything, it makes me admire you more. The relief that flooded me was so intense, it brought tears to my eyes. He didn't run. He didn't look at me differently. He was still there, solid and real beside me on that park bench. Our relationship deepened after that day. With the weight of secrecy lifted, I could be fully present with him, could begin to explore the possibility of a love I had thought forever denied to me. Joseph was patient with my fears, understanding when old triggers resurfaced. He never pushed for physical intimacy, letting me set the pace, respecting my boundaries. When we finally did make love nearly a year after we began dating, it was on my terms in my time. There were difficult moments, flashbacks, tears, but also tender discovery, healing, connection. For the first time, I experienced intimacy as something beautiful rather than terrifying. We married in 1988, a simple ceremony in the garden of the boarding house where I had first lived. My mother came from Norfolk, supported by Mrs. Eunice. My uncle Augustus came in his dress uniform. Joseph's son, Michael, stood as his best man. It was small, just a handful of friends, but it was perfect. Life settled into a sweet routine. We merged our businesses, creating a larger salon that served both men and women. We bought a small house in the Victorian district with a garden I filled with flowers and herbs. We hosted Sunday dinners for friends, went for long walks along the river, built a life rich in simple pleasures. But there was one question that haunted me, one fear I couldn't shake: children. I wanted a child, desperately wanted to create a family different from the one I had known, to prove that the cycle could be broken. But I was terrified. What if the damage done to me had broken something essential? What if I couldn't be a good mother? What if my own child triggered memories I thought I had overcome? Joseph never pressured me. He had Michael, he said, and that was enough. But I saw the way he looked at babies when we passed them in the street, how he would linger when friends brought their children to visit. He would be such a wonderful father. I took the question back to therapy, which I had continued even after moving to Savannah, finding a new therapist, Dr. Lowell, who specialized in trauma survivors. What's the real fear, Margaret? Yeah, she asked during one session. That I'll be like them, I whispered. Like my father, like what Thomas became. Do you truly believe that? Her voice was gentle but firm. After all the work you've done, after all the evidence to the contrary. I thought about it, really thought about it.
No, I said finally. I don't, but I'm afraid all the same.
Fear doesn't mean you shouldn't act, she replied. It just means you're human with human concerns. The question is whether the fear will control your decisions or whether you will. In 1990, at 33 years old, I made the decision to stop taking birth control. 9 months later, our daughter Lucy was born, 7 pounds, 4 ounces, with her father's thoughtful eyes and my stubborn chin. The first time I held her looking down at that tiny face, I was flooded not with fear, as I had expected, but with a fierce, protective love so strong it took my breath away. This child, this perfect small person, was a new beginning, untouched by the past that had nearly destroyed me. "Hello, Lucy," I whispered, touching her velvet cheek. "I promise you'll never know the kind of pain I knew. I promise you'll always be safe, always be loved, just as you are." And I kept that promise. Through sleepless nights, through toddler tantrums, through all the joys and challenges of raising a child, I remained vigilant, not just against external threats, but against the wounded parts of myself that might have reproduced the patterns of my own childhood. I went to therapy regularly, stayed committed to my sobriety, worked every day to be the mother Lucy deserved. Joseph was the father I had wished for as a child, kind, consistent, present. Together we created the stable, loving home that had been denied to both of us in different ways. Our salon thrived, expanding to include a small spa. We added play area for clients' children, and our own Lucy, who grew up among the scents of shampoo and hair dye, entertaining customers with her cheerful chatter. My mother moved to Savannah in 1995 when her health began to decline further. We converted our garage into a small apartment for her, making it accessible for her wheelchair. Having her close, being able to care for her in her final years, was a gift, a chance to strengthen the bond that had been tested but never broken by all we had endured together. She died peacefully in 2001, having lived to see Lucy start school, having witnessed the woman I had become despite everything. At her funeral, I spoke of her courage, her sacrifice, how she had saved me not once, but many times. I didn't speak of my father, of Thomas of the darkness. Some stories aren't for public sharing. Life continued to unfold with its mix of joy and sorrow. Lucy grew into a thoughtful teenager, then a determined young woman who decided to study psychology, inspired, she said, by my story, which I had shared with her in age-appropriate ways as she grew. Joseph and I sold the salon in 2015, when we decided to retire, wanting more time for travel, for hobbies for each other. We nearly lost Joseph in 2020 to a sudden heart attack. Sitting beside his hospital bed, watching the monitors, I was struck by how far I had come from that frightened girl in Norfolk. I could face this crisis not with alcohol, not with thoughts of suicide, but with the strength built over decades of healing, with the support of friends and family, with the knowledge that whatever happened, I would endure. Joseph recovered, thank God. And in 2022, Lucy gave us the most precious gift, our granddaughter Mary Helen, named after both our mothers. Holding that tiny girl, I marveled at the journey that had brought me here, from a child damaged by those who should have protected her to a grandmother watching the next generation begin untouched by that legacy of pain. Which brings me back to where I began, sitting here in my home in Asheville, North Carolina, where Joseph and I moved 3 years ago to be closer to Lucy and her family. At 68, my hands are not as steady as they once were. My back protests after a long day in the garden, but my heart is whole in a way I never thought possible. I never saw Thomas again after that day in 1972. I learned through my grandmother that he did indeed join the Army after high school, served in various places around the world. Whether the therapy helped, whether he overcame the poison our father had planted in him, I don't know. Some questions don't have answers, or at least not answers we can access in this life. What I do know is this trauma doesn't have to be the end of the story. It can be the beginning, the painful beginning of a journey toward healing.
It has taken me 50 years to truly understand that the things that happened to me, terrible as they were, don't define me. What defines me are the choices I made afterward to seek help, to fight for sobriety, to risk love, to create a family based on respect and kindness, to break the cycle of abuse. I share this story not for sympathy or attention, but because I know there are others out there living in similar darkness, believing as I once did that there is no way out, no possibility of a life not dominated by the wounds of the past. To you, I say there is hope. The road is long and brutally hard, but healing is possible. You are not what was done to you. You are what you choose to become in spite of it. The day I decided to start this online channel, Joseph asked me if I was sure I wanted to be so public with my history. I told him that at my age, with the life I've lived, shame no longer has power over me. If my story helps even one person find the courage to seek help, to step away from the edge of that roof, then any discomfort I might feel is a small price to pay. So here I am, Margaret Williams, 68 years old, survivor, alcoholic and recovery hairdresser, wife, mother, grandmother, telling you the hardest story I know, my own, and telling you that your story, however dark its chapters might be right now, isn't finished either. There are still pages to be written, light to be found. Hold on. Reach out. The dawn comes even after the longest night.